A lot of people I know find comfort in believing there is something fundamentally unknowable about how our minds work. Neuroscience tends to make people like this uncomfortable, because they would rather not contemplate the idea that cognition may be a product of our brains. One reason this makes them uncomfortable is because brains are governed by the laws of physics, which implies that they might be governed by the laws of physics. They don't like the idea that their decisions could potentially be predicted, because if their decisions could potentially be predicted, even in theory, that would imply that we have no free will. Now, if people have no free will, they reason, then we are just products of our programming. That would render us mere biological machines with no accountability for our choices. And if there's no accountability, then no choices can even be called wrong. And if people believe that, then they'll just do whatever they want. Immorality will reign unchecked, and society will collapse into total chaos. Thus, these people may argue we have a moral imperative to believe in the unknowable. Now, this particular chain of reasoning may be popular, but that doesn't make it good reasoning. It turns out that determinism actually does not oppose accountability. What it opposes is a destructive form of punitive retribution. And in fact, making constructive corrections actually depends on determinism. I think these connections are very important for having a clear understanding about determinism. So let's discuss the reasons. Let's consider a self-driving car. I picked this example because self-driving cars are well known to be deterministic. That means their decisions are completely determined by their programming. For example, a programmer might direct a self-driving car to slow down if it senses a bouncing ball. This might be a good decision because a ball may be a sign that children are playing nearby. Note that both the programmer and the car spend some amount of energy thinking about this situation. From the perspective of the programmer, that thinking was hypothetical, general, or anticipatory. But the car performs its calculations in the actual situation in real time, and its computations directly lead to actions. Now suppose a car makes a poor decision. Perhaps it swerves left when it should have swerved right, or maybe it speeds up when it should have slowed down. Is there any value in tracking this error? Of course there is. The lives of children could be on the line here. Computer programmers go to great lengths to keep track of bugs in their software. In fact, they use specialized software just to document all their bugs and make sure that they all get fixed. Now let us contrast two candidate attitudes we could take towards software bugs, punitive and corrective. A person with a punitive attitude might observe that it makes no sense to punish the car. After all of its mistakes are really the fault of the programmer. So whenever a bug is found, we might just point at the programmer, tell him he's a bad programmer, and perhaps jab him with a red-hot poker. Maybe that will remind him to be more careful and stop producing code with bugs in it. By contrast, a person with a corrective attitude is more interested in getting those bugs fixed. Unfortunately, taking corrective actions is usually more difficult than taking punitive actions. It's not enough to just point at the car and say the bug is somewhere in its programming. That's obvious. Self-driving cars are complex systems. So to fix their problems, we need to identify specifically which parts are responsible. Maybe the subsystem that detects bouncing balls needs to be more accurate. Maybe it needs to be adjusted to respond more quickly. Maybe the subsystem that makes steering decisions needs to make different choices under different conditions. It can be important to recognize that the fault is not always caused by just one subsystem. Sometimes there are multiple different ways to fix a particular bug. And sometimes there are bugs that require adjustments to be made in multiple subsystems simultaneously. So a person with a corrective attitude is not necessarily just looking for the origin of a problem. Rather, he's looking for the places where the simplest corrections can be made that will fix the problem. It is understandable that people who lived long ago tended to favor punitive attitudes. It is much easier to just blame the programmer. After all, he made all of those subsystems. At least that's how it worked back in the days when software was written by a single individual. But blaming the programmer leads to yet another problem. You see, the programmer was both produced and raised by his parents, so in theory, we could just push the finger of blame back a little bit further. And those parents had parents too. Now, if we keep going, we eventually find that the finger of blame will point directly at God for all of the world's problems. Obviously that will not do. Well, free will is one imaginary solution to this problem. It essentially protects God by stopping the finger of blame as soon as it reaches an entity capable of bearing guilt. There are many problems with this candidate solution, but the one I want to emphasize today is how very destructive the concept of free will tends to be in practice. As an example, suppose my friend robs a bank. He will probably be arrested and sentenced to serve time in prison. Now I might say that his punishment is just, because my friend has free will. In so doing, I'm suggesting that 100% of the blame rests on my friend. I'm essentially washing my hands of all responsibility by pointing the finger of blame squarely at the first individual capable of bearing guilt. In other words, I'm sweeping all responsibility that I may have to be a positive influence on my friend under the metaphorical rug. A much better solution is to take a corrective rather than punitive approach to justice. Instead of looking for the original cause of a problem, I can look instead for the places where the smallest changes will produce the most benefit. Of course, the biggest changes are probably needed inside my friend's brain. Robbing a bank was a really stupid decision. But the most complete solution probably also involves me trying a little bit more to be a better influence. In reality, no man is an island. We all have some degree of influence on those around us. And the ripples of those consequences emanate outward to affect the whole world in ways far too complex for anyone with a finite brain to fully anticipate. It's certainly easier to pretend that people are the original source of all their choices, but it's much more productive to acknowledge the factors we actually can understand and to make corrections rather than excuses. So determinism really is compatible with accountability, but only in the corrective sense, not in the punitive sense. It obviously doesn't make much sense to punish a deterministic machine, but it does make sense to adjust a deterministic machine. In fact, the corrections we make will only have effect to the extent that the systems we are adjusting behave deterministically. So embracing determinism helps keep the focus of accountability on building up rather than tearing down. And that's the good kind of accountability. Now, there's also a second reason many people are afraid to accept determinism. Many people feel that the concept of free will somehow protects something intimate and personal from being exposed or invaded. That is, free will keeps subjective things from being objectively analyzed. People like free will because it keeps the workings of their minds mysterious and incomprehensible. So anyone who criticizes them for being suboptimal can be dismissed as not really knowing what they're talking about. Fortunately, we don't actually need free will to protect our minds from objective analysis. They are already protected by something called chaos. To illustrate chaos, let us consider the weather. With enough scientific instruments, we can measure weather conditions in many different locations with very high precision. Let's suppose, as an example, our measurements are accurate to plus or minus 0.000000001 units. That would be pretty precise. And if we know the weather conditions that precisely, we can predict what the weather will be like 1 minute later with only slightly less precision. But that's good enough because it's still pretty darn precise. And since we now know what the weather will be like then, we can predict what the weather will be like in 2 minutes with slightly less precision, and in 3 minutes with just a little bit less precision, and so forth. So now, what do our measurements tell us about the weather 1 month from now? Absolutely nothing. Anything from a cloudless sunny day to a tornado could emerge from factors much too small for any scientific instrument to ever measure. The simplest machine capable of predicting the long-term weather on Earth is in fact the Earth itself. And it turns out that our brains are a lot like that too. Each neuron is known to behave deterministically. That means we can reliably predict their behavior based only on their input signals. But when many neurons start working together, their behavior becomes chaotic. That means any forecast loses some precision as time progresses. And that means that even in a completely deterministic universe, the simplest machine capable of anticipating your behavior is your own brain. Now, to be clear, that doesn't mean your brain is somehow optimal. Perhaps simpler machines could yet make better choices than you do, but no machine can predict exactly what choices your brain will make. Even if we had a machine that perfectly modeled your brain, which we don't, it would still be impossible to get it into precisely the same state as your brain is in. Slight imprecisions would always cause that machine to diverge from the behavior of your brain, and that divergence would compound exponentially with time. My point is, there's really nothing for free will to even protect. Even in a completely deterministic universe, your mind is still your own. Like the self-driving car, you are a product of the factors that shaped you. But you are the only one in your exact situation, and your choices are still yours to make. If you really think about it, you'll see that your predictable parts are what represent your character. It's not free will that makes you who you are, it's your deterministic parts that make you who you are. Those are the parts that really matter. And as determinists understand, that's all of them.